thought it'd be kind of interesting and kind of fun to do a video on WeWorks. For why exactly I knew very early on it was basically a fake business or something which you could consider to a certain degree as an actual scam for how exactly it failed and how exactly it started. So early on, with regarding to WeWorks, when I first heard of it, I knew loud and clear it was basically a scam. So why exactly I know it's a scam? Well, one of the things the founder said quite a few times, which always sounded to me very odd, was he basically said that his service is meant to be for graphic designers. Now, you have two main types of graphic designers before artificial intelligence took many of the jobs. You had the ones that worked at offices. These ones themselves don't need an office, they don't need to buy one, so this is already provided for them by whoever basically employs them. The other 50%, which are probably the more common ones as a whole, would be people who are self employed. That basically means that the majority of them who are doing graphic design work would do it out of their home, in most cases, or simply a library, an internet cafe, a coffee shop, or somewhere provides free internet. So, do they need an office? No. Is there any benefit from buying an office? No, because 95% of the clients they had or will get came from online things, so having an office made no sense for a graphic designer. Also, as well, you have to consider for graphic designers, a high proportion of them worked part time. So let's make it simple. If you design two graphics for, say, £50 a week, so you get £100 a week and, say, £400 a month approximately, is that enough money to pay rent? No. Okay, is that enough money to cover expenses of having a physical office? No. So having an office, if you're doing that sort of thing, doesn't make any sense. Now, you could put forward an argument, yeah, but I'll make more than that, potentially. But you're still going to struggle as a graphic designer unless you're in full-time money or you charge a load of money. So, for example, purposes, if you charge, say, £1,000 for a graphic, as an example, if you charge £1,000 and say, for argument's sake, you got four a month, then you could argue you could justify having a small office. It may be then worthwhile. But for most people in the graphic design era, that would never make sense. That was one of the big red flags which came up for me with regard to reworks, for why exactly I was pretty positive it was just a bullshit thing. And to better understand, you have to actually consider what exactly the purpose of reworks for. So you basically, in the traditional sense, when you rent something, you do it either simply direct from the landlord, direct from a real estate agent, but you basically do it direct. So, for example, purposes, if you're going to rent a office for, say, £3,000, if you're renting for £3,000 a month, that'd be the price you'd pay. But if you were going to apply what Reworks want to do, they basically rent it for you, then they charge you more money. So rather than you paying £3,000 a month, now you might pay, say, for example purposes, say £4,000 a month. So you're basically paying an extra £1,000 for an office. So you're paying extra money for no benefit for yourself or benefit for business, and in reality you're just putting the cost up. That was why in general I never really understood the whole concept or idea that some people were obsessed with, this idea of reworks, because it to me just always seemed a stupid idea, because you're just paying extra money for renting someone else's property when you get basically no benefits with regard to renting that property as a whole. Another thing as well I thought was quite funny was whole setup, so I was always confused and puzzled why so many people basically were willing to invest so much money into the company. Now, some people argue it's 10 billion, some people say it's 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, and some people put up to. But again, if we use basic business sense, how exactly can you have a high value for business when you don't own any assets? You don't own any assets. The only thing you in theory own is a website or something with a business name. And even if we're going to say the business name maybe sounds good, that as a whole is only worth so much. So the whole concept of, people investing such as SoftBank into things never made any sense to me, because you don't have any assets. You don't really have any legit assets. The only thing you have, in theory, is a brand or a brand name, which even that is only worth so much. I mean, if, for example, purposes you owned the brand Coca-Cola, then I could definitely see the logic, but WeWorks was never Coca-Cola or anything like that, or Apple, or some of her big successful brand like Nike or Reebok or Umbro or DC, among others. And another thing as well, which I also thought was quite bizarre about this from a perspective when I was doing accounts, the way I was taught to do accounts was When you invest in any single business, you're supposed to basically invest in something which is either making profit or has at least the bare minimum of the current assets. Basically, current assets means assets that go up and down, for why some people consider current assets like a river, such as, for example, purchases cash, is a good example because your cash is going up and down, depending, of course, how much you're spending, among others. So, make it simple. If you have, say, £10,000 worth of current assets, so make it simple, we just have one asset, cash. If we have £10,000 of cash, and we got, say, £10,000 of current liabilities, basically liabilities or short-term debt you have to pay, such as the creditors, direct debits, that kind of stuff, then you could argue if you had 10,000 of liabilities and say 10,000 of current assets, then you could argue if you invest in this business, it will be pretty safe. Because in theory, your current assets itself will cover your costs of your debt. That is an example of what you can consider if you're going to invest in a small scale business. You could consider that in theory a semi-safe dry because the current assets will cover it, so you don't have to worry about the fixed assets. The fixed assets itself, in simple terms, is real estate, the house, the property, or big things which cost a lot of money. But in the case of, WeWorks, they owned approximately 600 offices or 550, depending on where you read the data, but they didn't really own any of these because they didn't own any offices. They also didn't really own any current assets, really. So the whole concept of a business made no sense. You're basically just buying into a dream or buying into what you could consider a certain like a Ponzi scheme. Because if you consider when people stop investing in something like that, it always fails. And one of the things that really intrigued me and surprised me about it was how many people got tricked by such a simple thing to see. Because if you consider it as a business idea, does it really make much sense? No. I mean, if for example purposes, let's make it simple. If someone has gone bankrupt or a few people have gone bankrupt and for some reason that means they can't basically pay rent because they won't get accepted on a credit check, then I could definitely see the sense for certain people to say buy through WeWorks. But again, even we're going to say the target market is all people who've gone bankrupt, out of the people who have gone bankrupt, how many people would actually be willing to pay for WeWork style service? Not really that many. Because you're just basically buying into a dream rather than buying into a business. And that was really why I was really thought it was funny when so many dumb people invested in it with regard to such as SoftBank, when you basically invest in something which wasn't a business. In order for a business, it has to be making some level of profit. That is basically the defining feature of a business. A business itself is supposed to make profit. If it doesn't make profit, it's not a business, it's a liability, and that's what most people consider it. Anyway, I hope it makes sense to you. Have a good day, good week. Thanks. Bye.